American dream for me means like working hard, you know what I mean? Like every day working.
Pedro used to be pretty well liked by everyone.
What do you think is the reason why the networks decided, hey, we want them to have their own show and not just be part of the 90 Days?
I think so because we had a lot of problems. Tenemos muchos problemas, tal vez.
But then everything came crashing down around him when he started treating Chantel really badly.
I was on children.
How many?
I was on children. But right now we know available. The oven right now is not working.
And now people are saying he might actually be a gold digger.
Hey, you need to go to school.
Yeah,
that's the plan.
That's more thing, you know. I need to go to the school too. I know can be working in that warehouse for the rest of my life.
And you'll never believe why. So guys, for years there's been a ton of speculation about Pedro's real reasons for being married to Chantel, and everyone's been wondering if the marriage was just an elaborate way for Pedro to be able to get his visa, and recently Pedro's actions have definitely been making it seem that way, and his behavior in season 4 of the show has been eye-opening to say the least. So throughout the season, Pedro's real intentions were shown through his cruel behavior towards Chantel and some shady remarks he made about money, and Chantel's own family had even been suspecting that Pedro was only after money and a green card from the beginning, but they supported Chantel and her choice to stay in the marriage, and now it appears that Pedro isn't trying too hard to hide his motives, and what his actions have revealed is honestly crazy. So Pedro and Chantel's roller coaster of a marriage came to an unexpected stop at the end of Family Chantel, and I have to say, even though I felt terrible for Chantel, I was relieved that she was finally starting to see Pedro for who he really seemed to be the entire time, and before Pedro unexpectedly filed for divorce, he displayed such cruel behavior towards Chantel that it's seriously unbelievable. And Pedro and Chantel had recently bought a beautiful new home, but they, surprisingly weren't spending too much time together at all, and Chantel admitted that her rocky marriage wasn't getting any better, mostly because Pedro was barely around, and she seemed confused about how to solve all of the problems that Pedro had pointed out, and his reasons for never being at home were honestly very suspicious. And when Chantel mentioned that there were times Pedro wouldn't come home until 3 a.m. and she had no idea where he'd been all night, he handled the conversation in a seriously bizarre way. He blew off his wife's worries and even told her that he didn't need to tell her where he was, and Pedro claimed that he was either working at the real estate office or hanging out with his co-workers, and Chantel kept pushing the issue of him acting weird and distant around her, and then made her own crazy confession, and Chantel admitted that she didn't understand why Pedro was acting so shady unless he had already gotten everything he wanted from her, and she shockingly claimed that now that Pedro had his visa, money, and a job, he didn't seem to want to have anything to do with her anymore. And this added even more fuel to the theories about Pedro and led many people to reflect on the many other times that he had acted cruel and cold towards Chantel over the years. And in a throwback video shared on Reddit, social media users reflected on Pedro's history of threatening Chantel with divorce, and it turns out that Pedro's knowledge of the whole green card process might have been the only thing kind of keeping him around. And this is honestly insane, because during the clip of 90 Day Fiancé, Pedro was seen telling his wife that when 10 years is up and he gets his green card, it was going to be over for them if she didn't fix her attitude. And Chantel fired back and told Pedro not to make threats like that, but Pedro didn't seem to care, and many of the comments on Reddit pointed out his lack of consideration for Chantel's feelings. And not only that, but it really started to seem like maybe Pedro and his family really might have been using Chantel all along. And Chantel and her relationships with Pedro's mother, Lydia, and his sister, Nicole, were strained for years, and both Chantel and Pedro's families have called each other out and even had physical brawls throughout the years. And a huge source of tension was the crazy claim that Pedro and his family had only been, after Chantel's money, and in some surprising ways, it appears that gold-digging allegation might possibly be true, because even though Chantel and Pedro signed a prenup agreement to protect her family inheritance money, he and his family have had definitely benefited financially. I mean, many times it even seemed like Pedro prioritized the well-being of his family in the Dominican Republic over his wife, who was pursuing a degree in nursing, and his decisions over the years have been seriously insane. And after they got married, Chantel and Pedro constantly butted heads over his choice to regularly send his family money and expensive gifts, and allegedly Pedro was sending around $300 a month back to Lydia and Nicole. And even though Chantel was still in school and probably not bringing in very much money, and at one point Chantel hinted that Pedro didn't usually contribute to their one-bedroom apartment's rent, and this makes what his family revealed next seem even crazier, because Chantel was shocked when she found out that Lydia and Nicole had moved into a huge rental house, and Pedro and Chantel's apartment was cramped, but his family's new home had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, dining room, and living room. And when Chantel called Pedro out on paying for his family to live better than they do, he responded in an unbelievable way. You know, Pedro claimed that the cost of renting in the Dominican Republic are about 10% of what they are in America, but rent wasn't the only thing that he was covering for his family. He had apparently been paying for their move and clothes and whatever else they needed, and Pedro's mom and sister even expected gifts whenever he visited them, and not just any items, but what Chantel revealed was incredibly unexpected. I mean, allegedly, Lydia would make lists of items she wanted to be sent as gifts, and Chantel started questioning Lydia's motives and even expressed her worries to Pedro, but Pedro didn't seem to agree at all and told Chantel that Dominican Republic culture was different from America, and he was supposed to help his family. And while that's a valid cultural difference, I mean, some people pointed out that this just still felt kind of strange, and many people understood that Pedro sending money back home was because of his culture, but, felt that this was his way of going about it was wrong. And allegedly, Pedro started sending more money and gifts and paying for even more things behind Chantel's back, and he was working at a warehouse job that probably didn't pay very much, but he was still always helping his family out before, worrying about his life with Chantel. And this made an outrageous recent scene from the family Chantel seem even more crazy, because after Pedro decided that he wanted to separate from Chantel, but not yet file for divorce, she made a surprising decision. She flew to the Dominican Republic in order to fix her relationship with Lydia without telling Pedro, and Chantel figured that since she and his family hadn't gotten along for years, this might show Pedro that their marriage was worth saving. And not only was he furious with Chantel, but he also made a shocking confession about his mother, because Pedro unbelievably claimed that Chantel had tried to win over Lydia with a pair of Gucci sunglasses, because according to him, his mother is a gold digger. And this made everyone wonder if all the money and gifts he sent were all in the name of cultural differences, or if Pedro was just trying to keep his mom happy. But regardless, Pedro felt like Chantel's motives weren't for the right reasons, and he later used Chantel's trip against her in a bizarre way, because when Pedro and Chantel returned home, he couldn't understand where she had been coming from and asked her for a divorce. And Pedro barely even let the news sink in when he surprised Chantel by announcing that he had made another very quick choice, because during a crazy scene where Chantel was resting, Pedro walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed to announce that he was moving out. And not only was he, breaking some big news to her, but he already had a U-Haul moving truck sitting in the driveway, and Pedro had signed a lease for his own apartment and then decided to tell Chantel that he wanted to move out. I can't imagine springing so much on someone, let alone in this really cold way that Pedro did it in, and things took an even more unexpected turn after that. And after Pedro made the push to file for divorce, everyone started noticing something about him that seemed super suspicious. And when the lawyer mentioned that divorce is like a tragic loss, Pedro appeared to get almost emotional, which is a rare sight to see. However, he didn't actually shed any tears or show any actual signs of sadness in his face. I mean, it all just seemed like it could just be an act until something unbelievable happened. Pedro showed some real anger and sadness when he revealed that Chantel had moved $265,000 out of their joint bank account. And seeing Chantel be hurt over his inconsiderate actions hadn't seemed to, bother Pedro at all compared to how how insanely he reacted when he found out that the money was gone. And even though Pedro had repeatedly ignored Chantel and her attempts to fix the marriage, he was incredibly mad that she wouldn't answer his phone calls about the money, and he even showed up at her family's house and demanded that her dad and sister tell Chantel to put half the money back into the account. However, some people are theorizing that the money that was in the account wasn't even half of Pedro's funds to begin with, and it's honestly kind of crazy because apparently some Reddit users believe that most of the money that was in the emptied account didn't even belong to Pedro, and allegedly some people think that Chantel may have inherited $250,000 for her 30th birthday as part of her family trust fund. And if that's the case, Pedro's claim to wanting half of the money in the account doesn't really hold up well legally. Until money came into play, Pedro had ignored Chantel after blaming her for everything. And even though, she was doing the things that he wanted, he still neglected her completely. And it really seemed like Pedro was manipulating situations to appear to be Chantel's fault, and he seemed to not want to communicate with her at all until he wanted to know where the money was at. And he even put the blame on Chantel for him not having any money outside of the emptied account, and it was such an outrageous reach. And Pedro claimed that Chantel had made it impossible to work despite him spending all of his time at work or drinking with his coworkers. And Pedro even said that it would take him a month or two to be able to see any real estate clients, and he was in total disbelief that Chantel would leave him with nothing. And after Pedro finally tracked Chantel down, they had an explosive fight before she threatened him with calling the cops. And after their nasty argument, both Pedro and Chantel ended up filing restraining orders against each other, and I honestly cannot believe how messy the end of their marriage ended up. And it was mostly because of Pedro's lack of consideration for anything other than money, and it definitely looked like Pedro was planning to wait 10 years to file for divorce until he realized he didn't have to, and then it seemed like the process couldn't happen soon enough. And I feel like Chantel was right. Pedro was legally living in the United States, had secured a career in real estate, and ended up renting his own apartment, and it seemed like he had no need for Chantel anymore. And honestly, the way he just discarded her and treated her throughout the process just seemed completely heartless. But what do you guys think about Pedro and Chantel's explosive end to their marriage? Do you believe that Pedro was in it for love, money, or maybe both? And do you think that Pedro should get half of the money that was in the account? Let me know in the comments below.